Good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending upon when you happen to be listening to this podcast. This is The Farm, and your host for this installment is Recluse, aka Steven Snyder. My partner Frank Zero will not be joining us for this as he works on another podcast for the week, so we can get two out to you guys after not having had any additional content up this past week. Sorry about that, but like I said, hopefully we can make it up to you with the two podcasts this week. With all the coronavirus stuff going around, Frank is going to try to do something about pop culture so you guys can take your minds off of the hysteria and so forth. As for me, I'm doubling down. For this installment, I'm going to focus on the deep politics of the coronavirus, the myths and realities of the conspiracy theories surrounding it, and what the aftermath will look like. Joining me for this discussion is the great John Brisson of We've Read the Documents. Fans of my blog, Vise Up, know I'm a regular guest there, and it's with great pleasure to have John on the farm this time around. John, thanks so much for dropping by today.
Anytime, Steven. Thank you for having me on the farm, brother.
Thanks again, man. All right, so I know you've done a tremendous amount of research on Corona. Before we really get going on some of the conspiracies and what have you, can you give the listeners a brief outline of what you think is the hardest evidence concerning the virus?
Yeah, so I've been following what's been happening in China and I guess, all over the world for almost about a month and a half, almost 2 months now. And at first I thought it was going to be just like every other standard pandemic that's out there. I thought it would be like SARS was back in the early 2000s, or MERS, or even Zika. How they always bring these pandemics on, and yeah, tragically, some people do get sick and do die. Don't get me wrong, but they kind of hype them as being this global pandemic that's going to sweep the world. H1N1 under Obama. So I kind of brushed it off. I was like, no, there's no, this is going to be like all the rest of them. There's nothing really to worry about here. It's not going to massively affect anything, or they're not going to, drop the hammer as they're doing currently now, it seems like. So I had some normie friends who started looking at the data of people dying and calculating the fatality rate, case fatality rate. And they were like, well, the statistics aren't adding up. And I was like, well, what are you talking about? And I've heard certain people like Mr. Medicare, who I am a fan of Jim's work, and Jim interviewed me on the Finders, and him, talking about it for a while, and me just kind of being like, well, I don't think it's really going to be anything. I just don't, I don't think it's going to turn anything. But he was like, look at this. I don't understand why the countries are lying. And I looked, and his fatality rate was between 2 to 3%. Now, the average seasonal flu case fatality rate is about 0.10%. So 0.10% of, or less, of people that get the flu in the continental United States, for example, they will die. In this case, it looked about to be 2 to 3%. Maybe higher, depending on the location, the geographical location, if the numbers reported were accurate. So I said, oh, okay, that's weird. I hadn't really, thought of it that maybe it was actually something to be concerned about from both maybe the viral side or, the martial law government side of things, the parapolitical side of things. So I started researching, and I started, seeing videos coming out of China. And it was very hard to determine if these were real or not, because when you're in the fog of war, when and not knowing, you look back and look on things and you can see what happened. But with this, Stephen, it's very difficult to see because you're getting all this information. You can't tell what's real. You're trying to verify things. But I kept seeing videos of like them welding apartment buildings shut in Wuhan, China, where they said that the coronavirus outbreak occurred as early as mid to end December, or maybe even, November, or maybe even previously beforehand. Some people have said there's a possibility that it could have occurred during the Wuhan military games that were occurring in Wuhan, China. Of course, America, and we'll get to maybe who is at fault if this is a bioweapon later on. That America had participated in those military games that happened in Wuhan. So you have different theories of, who's patient zero. Was it because the Chinese eat bats, for example, which can be a carrier of coronaviruses, or is this, was this released at the Wuhan military games? Was this released mistakenly on purpose by the bioresearch laboratory that's in Wuhan? There's a lot of conflicting theories, and it's like 9/11. People have how or who were the perpetrators of 9/11. So it's kind of like the same thing with here, where we'll never truly get down 100% to the bottom of it. But when I started seeing those videos, I was like, oh, maybe there is something to this. So I found a camera feed that someone had put on YouTube, and it was of Wuhan. It was different cameras that were stationed in Wuhan, and I located. I looked on Google Maps, whether the cameras were accurate. And I started noticing that there was not a lot of traffic. And then I went on Twitter and started searching certain terms in Mandarin. I started searching Wuhan and epidemic and illness and sickness and the different provinces of China to see if I could get any videos. And I have a sister-in-law who knows Mandarin. And so I was like, okay, so what are the stuff that's coming up in Google Translate, is this accurate? Or the people that are translating the videos, is this accurate? And she said, yeah, it is. You can tell by certain dialects, when they say that I'm teacher, and you're my students, that'd be kind of like a colloquialism. We have many colloquialisms here in the United States. So it'd be kind of something that they would use or talk about. So that seemed to be accurate in the translation. And it seemed to be affecting a lot of China. A lot of China. And then you would see, like, if it's propaganda or not, the sulfur dioxide readings, that came out in the media. Stephen, have you seen those by chance?
No, I have not. I don't think.
Where they were reduced around almost every part of China except for Beijing, and atmospheric wise. And you can actually go to websites and look at it and look at those and see if they've changed. And some people noticed, like TomTom and Garmin, the GPS, how traffic reports in Wuhan have not returned to normal. Well, those cameras I was talking about in a city that has a population larger than New York City, Wuhan, and it's beautiful architecture, beautiful city. The traffic there hadn't returned even when the Chinese said it was over. When the communist CCP, Communist Party of China, when they had mentioned it, it was not over with. The people of Wuhan were not going to work. They were still stuck in their apartments, or God forbid, quarantined till they died of starvation. I don't know, but it's still slow. They still haven't completely recovered yet. The traffic that you expect to see in a city of more than 10 million people.
Well, I know one of the accounts I had read was arguing that even though China in theory is in recovery now and should be able to get its, industrial capability back up and running, now they're kind of faced with the situation where there's no market for anything because the rest of the world is now going through this as well. So it's kind of like, yes, this is because, certainly I think it probably is a combination of the two, just the ongoing virus carrying out, along with the fact that, international demand for their manufactured products has really collapsed in a lot of the rest of the world simultaneously.
Yeah, even with supply chain, Stephen, even if, let's say, let's take the stance that the virus is real and it is possibly serious. If that is the case, even if China comes back online and they, there's no second wave, and they've beaten it or whatever, well, by the time they've come online, we're not going to be online. We're not going to be able to consume the massive amounts of goods that are coming out of China. And it takes time for a factory to get the raw materials to produce what is needed, and for that to be, moved by trucks to the shipping yards, to be put on freighters, to be shipped across the Pacific Ocean. It all takes time. So we can't, so this is something that, and I guess we'll talk later when we talk more about the parapolitics side of things. This is a huge blow to globalism. Globalism, I don't see it surviving out of this, at least in its current form, because it's all the flaws of globalism have been shown, especially with the supply chain and on-demand delivery. It's just not there. Anybody who goes to the grocery store and has seen, because of the mass panic of people trying to hoard food, not to say that people should not prepare if necessary. I'm not saying that at all. All the conspiracy theorists have been saying this for years. But just to see that, if this was a month or two ago, when you went to the grocery store, Stephen, everything that your little heart desires, except for maybe one or two things, you could get, right?
Oh, absolutely. Except usually my normal smoked salmon.
You can't now.
Exactly.
So there's definitely a breakdown of the supply chain. Whether the virus is as serious as some people believe it to be or not, there are issues with the economic supply chain or global supply chain. So I don't know how long that's going to last. I don't know its effects on the economy completely. You know, the stock market keeps going up and down, but they inflate it and inject as much money as the Fed can possibly can. It's all a sham anyway. So I guess the only thing I can say about the hardest evidence concerning the actual virus of it being real is just see what's happening over in China. Go to Twitter and search Mandarin characters. Go to Twitter and search using Italian characters or you know, the Italian language or Spanish for Spain, and just see if you can get accounts. Because one thing I've always wondered is the rest of the world as locked down as we're told it is, or are we the ones that are locked down when it comes to social media, Stephen? Are we the ones that have trouble seeing stuff of the outside world, or is it vice versa, or is it a little bit of both? You know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely.
So I don't know. I mean, just go look, go start to try to get accounts. You're going to start seeing accounts now of people that you know have came in contact with the virus. For example, I have a friend who works in a hospital in Queens, New York, and he's a normie. He doesn't understand conspiracy theorists, but he's saying that hasn't seen anything like this. He's a cardiac care nurse. He's very dedicated at what he does, and you know they have almost over 300 patients positive for it in the hospital. So it'll take a few more weeks before we get the strong wave where you're really going to start to see it, and people are almost going to be able to deny at that point that it's a complete hoax, which some people say the virus does not exist at all. I disagree. It may not be as bad as some people believe it to be. I don't know yet. I'm still on the fence about that too, even though my friend is telling me it's pretty bad. So you have to wait and see. I mean, there were videos, I don't know if you've seen them, of people looking at Italian like newspapers and just page and page after of obituaries, Stephen.
Yeah, no, I've heard those accounts as well.
And I mean, you're going to see that here if it is bad as some people believe it to be. I don't know. You know what I mean? It's kind of like the fog of war. I mean, how do you feel about, everything I've said? Where do you stand?
Well, I mean, I think, you're probably pretty spot on. I mean, I'm definitely still skeptical as to just how bad the death toll will really be for this. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of reports with the deaths in Italy. Many of the people dying also had pre-existing medical conditions. And then on top of that, the Italian population is also an aging one. So, I mean, the two factors, an aging population and
Yes.
pre-existing medical conditions. I mean, almost inevitably, these would be the kinds of people that would be more affected by a major outbreak in the first place, which is one of the reasons why I find some of the bioweapons stuff to be a little speculative. I mean, it's just, I feel partly like it would have been a little more devastating if it was an actual bioweapon. I mean, I've seen people try to argue like, well, it's a form of eugenics because it's targeting
Yes.
the weak and the infirm, but it's just like typically these are the people that are most affected by viruses in the first place when there's an outbreak. I mean,
But the
that's
thing is we're learning now, though, that may not necessarily the case, that was old news, that it is affecting the young. And in some
yeah.
cases, pretty bad. I mean, even my friend was telling me that there were 30-year-old on ventilators, a few of them with no pre-existing conditions that are
Yes.
known. So that actually may change in the next couple of weeks. I don't know. It may always have been that it was taking out the elderly and people who are obese or had high blood pressure. We don't know because a lot of our studies and a lot of our information, came from China and is now coming from out of Italy. And the information out of Italy, Italy has an older population. That is true. But the United States, not so much. However, I would actually argue that we might have bigger problems because of our obesity rates that Italy does not have.
Mm.
But we'll just have to wait and see at that point.
Absolutely. Well, so, getting into my next question here, do you think that this was a pure black swan? Do you think there might have been some kind of calculation behind it, or maybe a combination of the two? I mean, it certainly seems like governments were initially taken off guard, but since then transnational cabals have started to manipulate things to their own agendas. I mean, what's your take on that?
All right, I'm just going to speculate on here. And this is all speculation. This is fog of war. I I could see any of those. I could see that it was deliberate. I could see that it was an act of God or nature. I could see it being a combination of the two, never letting a good crisis go to waste. I will say some interesting things in that Russia, if they're reporting their numbers accurately, they seem to not have as many cases, even though they're on the border of China, and seem to shut things down, which I find to be a little odd. And it's almost like they almost had a pre-knowledge of it. And if we look at the countries that are being affected negatively the most, you had China first, then you had Iran. We still really truly don't know what's coming out of Iran. We have heard stories of mass graves showing up on like Google Earth, for example, where they had digged because they're not cremating bodies in Iran. So we really don't know how bad Iran has gotten it. It could be very bad. It could be possibly worse than China, if not China's worse. Because, I mean, did you see one thing where the Chinese, it came out that 20 million cell phones have been deregistered in China? Stephen, did you see that?
No, I did not.
So some of that could be just because they weren't able to pay their bills because they were in quarantine, right?
Mm-hmm.
But how many of those were from deaths? We truly don't know. So we don't know how bad it was in Iran. So, I mean, the question is so complicated. I could see it in all the ways that it's asked. I think it's likely that it was probably... I'd say it's more likely that it was deliberate, in my opinion, or a combination of the two than beside just a pure black swan event. Did you see how China, how they seem to be more prepared in that they claimed that they had more ECMO units and were able to oxygenate the blood better and build those temporary hospitals, and that you see the Chinese wearing like Tyvek suits and taking it more serious like the Italians were. But the Americans don't seem to be doing the same level of preparation like you expect in a bioweapon, So a bioweapon, you expect someone to come in with like the full garb that the CDC garb that you see in movies, right? Like Contagion, And that's what they were doing over there in China to some degree, and what they were doing in Italy when you see the pictures, but they're not doing that here from what I've seen. So I don't know. It's a little odd. And I guess when we talk about the parapolitics side of things, some people say it's the United States because, like Plum Island, we weaponized certain strains of Borrelia that prefer manganese over iron for replication. That many people believe, including myself, believe the cause of Lyme disease that came out of Lyme, Connecticut. That Lyme disease had always existed, and Borrelia infections had always existed a certain time beforehand. But the more virulent strain that causes a Borrelia that causes Lyme disease, chronic Lyme disease, is man-made. Just like West Nile virus, for example, which was found in one of the boroughs of New York City, I can't remember, in 1999. They've also implicated that it was spread by Plum Island too as well, because it'd be very difficult for a mosquito to get all the way from the depths of Africa to one of the boroughs in New York and survive that whole time to infect someone. So it's a possibility. Like I said, Mark from Houstonic Live has done some research to show that there's a possibility that the bioweapon was released by the United States at the Wuhan Games. And I'll get to a little bit more about that in a minute. It's a possibility that China accidentally released it, or maybe even purposely to curtail maybe the Hong Kong riots that were going on. Maybe because of that, or maybe by mistake it got released out of the Wuhan biolab. Maybe it's a possibility, like I said, that Russia, they had maybe some foreknowledge, and things seem to be going very well for the Russians, at least by what's reported in the media. And I've seen all, implications of Israel too as well, of how they took it very seriously early on, but they seem to have had a lot of cases since then. So I don't know if any of these countries, it's a bioweapon from any of them, or it's not. It's just, it's a black swan event. I don't know.
I gotta ask though. I mean, there's been, for years speculation that potentially beginning in the 80s, maybe even sooner than that, there had been a bioweapons program that was being run jointly by Apartheid South Africa and Israel, where essentially they were trying to create bioweapons that would target certain races or ethnicities or something to that
Yes.
effect. And it is kind of interesting. You look at where it's breaking out. It's breaking out in China. It's breaking out in Iran. Italy, of course, has had a large breakout too, which is nominally a European population. But because the Italians, also kind of going back to the Roman Empire, but also just the general location they have right there in the Mediterranean across from North Africa, there's been a lot of African DNA that's intermingled with the native Italian one for quite a considerable amount of time now as well. So
Yes.
do you think maybe there might be a certain element of that at play?
Possible, Stephen. I would also say that there have been early reports of multiple strains, one being more lethal than the other, which would also lead credence to it being an engineered bioweapon. And there was also a early withdrawn paper by India, researchers in India, that had the HIV spike protein added to it, even though that paper was withdrawn. So, I mean, I don't know. It's a possibility that, I mean, originally it was affecting ACE2, for example. The ACE2 receptor was how the coronavirus entered the cell. And many populations have mutations in ACE2 enzyme. Of course, ACE2 deals a lot with the angiotensin renin-aldosterone system, which helps your kidneys regulate sodium-potassium balance to increase blood pressure when necessary by increasing sodium levels and the bladder retaining water. So in Asian populations like Japan and China, for example, they don't really have polymorphisms or mutations in the ACE2 gene, so they are more susceptible to the coronavirus per se from a genetic standpoint than the Arabs are, or at least SARS-CoV-2, the Arab population or the Caucasian population, for example, or even to some degree, some people have theorized the African population, which is why there might be so few cases in Africa because of that.
But bizarrely, there really haven't been a lot of cases in Japan, though, have there?
The interesting thing about that is I don't think there really have been testing properly in Japan, and maybe that had been why. There were a lot of cases in South Korea. So it seems to be all those Asian countries, they seem to have issues with ACE2, at least from a genetic standpoint. Not everyone, And what happens is if you have a polymorphism in the ACE2 gene, your cells just have less ACE2 receptors. And there were other markers too, or other cellular receptors. I don't remember them offhand. That the coronavirus is also able to enter by as well. So I don't know. I think it might be very much plausible that it was a race-specific bioweapon. My argument would be to target Iranians, which have more Persian DNA than Arab and Asian populations. But I mean, again, that's just speculation. I will say this one last thing. You're well acquainted with Stephen K. Bannon, Council for National Policy member, right?
Oh,
Stephen?
yeah. Oh, yeah, absolutely.
He somehow or another, I don't know if he's got a crystal ball, I don't know what, but he actually did a stream with Jack Pisovic was on one of his war rooms discussing this pandemic in January and almost exact trajectory that we're on now, long before many people were even discussing or talking about it.
Wow. I mean, that's definitely significant. What was his ultimate projection for that then?
That it would lead to some sort of destruction of globalism, and it would be a massive pandemic that would circle the world and cause people to lose faith with China and almost possibly cause a Chinese civil war.
Well, that would be in keeping with many of his other theories. Certainly something that I think warrants some more discussion here in a little bit when we get into the parapolitics. But first, let's get into some of the broader conspiracy theories. So, yeah, one of the big ones making the round is that the possibility that this is all linked up to the 5G networks that are currently being rolled out. What's your take on that?
I don't think it's necessarily. I think there is a virus. I don't think it's directly caused by non-native EMF coming from 5G activation or 5G towers. I will say that 5G would have a greater effect, in my opinion, than 4G, just because there's more. The way 5G is, you have to have receptor sites more in a cluster locally than you do like a cell phone tower like you would have for 4G and 3G. So it would have a greater effect because you'd have more in one area, giving a greater concentration of being exposed to the non-native EMF radiation. Even though it is a common misconception that they're able to kind of like change the frequency. Like when they're putting in 5G, they're like, well, they're putting up 5G and it's going to be able to mind control people and do all this other stuff. Not exactly sure about that. You'd have to have a separate weapon for that, because a lot of these cell phone towers, for example, GSM, they have their own frequencies that they're able to broadcast per FCC regulations, at least here in the United States, to prevent against interference. So I guess the roundabout way saying is I don't think 5G is a singular cause of this. I do think there is a viral cause. Some people have said it's just been from the activation of 5G alone. However, I'm not discounting at all the negative effects of non-native EMF production and its effects on a person's health and well-being, which are been numerously documented by many researchers, and its negative effects on the body. So I do believe that 5G, it's just, since you're going to be exposed to a more concentrated non-native EMF, it's going to end up having more negative effects on your health, and it could weaken your immune system and allow the coronavirus to become more virulent and to cause more issues. But I would say there are countries that do supposedly have reported, if you believe the fourth estate, that they have cases of the coronavirus where 5G, let alone 4G in some instances, would not be in wide distribution. So I don't think it's singularly 5G like people are saying, but I am saying that the overexposure of non-native EMF that is in our daily everyday life does have some negative effect on our health, and doing so, could make us more susceptible to the coronavirus, whether it is a bioweapon or it is a natural occurrence.
Yeah, I think that's a very plausible explanation. I mean, certainly I don't think 5G is a catalyst, but I mean, it could be a contributed factor in terms of weakening our immune systems, as you're suggesting. So, I mean, that's, definitely something to keep in mind when you're being bombarded with all this 5G stuff on social media and so on and so forth. Now, on the whole, it seems like there are two competing narratives that have been emerging in alternative communities in regards to what's going on with all of this. So one camp sees it as the final push of the New World Order. Others see it as a coup by the anti-globalist faction. And certainly we're seeing battle lines being drawn in the U.S. between the Trump camp on the one hand and Bill Gates and the rest of the globalist camp on the other. Now, you've already kind of gone into a little bit about how China is in play with all of this and what have you, but certainly it seems like Trump is using this to continue to keep the pressure on them. But the thing with China, I mean, its fate seems to be really closely tied to the Western globalists. I mean, after a lot of China's rise is due to globalism, and a collapse would potentially be disastrous for the People's Republic. Is that your take on it?
Yes, it is, Stephen. But one thing, I guess I can see it both ways. I could see that if there is two competing factions, the right side of the world order, the left side of the world order, even though I believe, and I believe that you do too, that's kind of connected like in a pyramid structure, and it's kind of, they may argue at certain things, but at the top, it's kind of like an agenda, if there is an agenda to all this. Kind of like the differences between the CMP and the CFR, or Loss-Raquel and Bilderberg, for example. So if we're talking about the left side, which would be a more globalist side, which would be the CFR and the Bilderberg group, or the right side, which would be more of a nationalist side, and you can have the extremes to each other. Globalists, you can have communism. With nationalism, you can have fascism, which is more the Council for National Policy, Loss-Raquel side of things. There is a possibility that it could be a war of some sort, which is what Bannon, CMP member, would love more than all, right? To take down what he sees as an imminent threat, which is globalism, which I am no fan of. Don't get me wrong. I myself am a civic nationalist in the United States, but I do see an issue when nationalism evolves into fascism. That's a major problem. Just like when progressivism can turn into globalism, for example, which I think is a problem too. So it did expose the globalist side of things. I mean, look at the supply chain. What here in the United States do we really truly make? We make a few things here. Don't get me wrong, but in the grand scheme of things, most of our stuff that we go to buy, the corporatist Walmart, we go and buy stuff that's made in China, right? So that becomes a problem when that stuff can no longer be made from China and shipped here, whether it's by war, whether it's by global pandemic, which we're seeing now, So it wasn't necessarily a good idea to send all of our manufacturing over to China, expecting that the globalist, world society, the New World Order would always exist, and that are as long as capital is flowing over there and they're making it almost like slave labor that'll be shipped back here for us to use and just blow through. Well, that turns out if you have a major problem or there's some hiccup in that globalist structure, everything comes to a halt and economies are destroyed and ways of life are destroyed because of it. And we're seeing that now with this pandemic, whether it is natural or otherwise. So because of that, many people are going to end up suffering, and I'd be very interested to see if more manufacturing, which is something that Trump has fought for, at least as a platitude. And I'm no fan of Trump at all. I may have voted for him back in 2016 by how stupid I was. Once I later found out he's through all your work that you've done exposing Trump being a crook, his connections to Roy Cohn and Epstein, among other things, counts for national policy, and in my own work doing that too. So, but one of his talking points is and one of Bannon's is to destroy globalism. You see that with many nationalist leaders being elected almost as CNP puppets around the world, like Bolsonaro in Brazil, Viktor Orban. So you kind of see Boris Johnson. You kind of see all these puppets being put into place by the CNP. So I mean, I don't know. I would think that China. The only thing I could see that the globalists would not be destroyed from this, and it seems like something else is at deeper play. And I want to get your take on this. What if this was all to set up a World War III with China that the Council for National Policy has wanted forever?
Well, I mean, I could quite possibly see that as being a real scenario because, I mean, certainly this would be a way that you could have World War III without, destroying the planet or something to that effect. I mean, this fashion, I mean, you are going to wipe out, I mean, a potential amount of the human race, but the planet will survive. The factories and stuff will still be here, and you might be able to fundamentally cripple their society without, getting into any of the really serious, I mean, I suppose you could argue that a bioweapon is a weapon of mass destruction, but not something that would be a planetary destroyer, though. So, I mean, that is
not something like a neutron bomb,
Yeah. And I mean, even at a minimum, and I think this has been a long-term goal with China. I mean, this may well lead to a breakup of the People's Republic of China into smaller and more, marginal states or something to that effect as well. So, I mean, certainly that could be another factor, a kind of subtle way to break up China in this World War scenario without, having to really bring out the nukes or, any of this other stuff that they probably have sitting around that we haven't even seen yet.
And it does seem like that's what Stephen K. Bannon want, and what many of the National Council for National Policy, where they kind of either want Middle East wars that you see in Iran, or they want wars with North Korea and China, which is kind of more like your Joel Skousen or CNP or Tucker Carlson, for example. They don't really want the wars in the Middle East. They want the wars with China and North Korea. And it seems like that might be what's coming out of this. I mean, Trump's keep calling it the China virus. Your Pompeo is very adamant about that, saying that anybody who questions whether the virus comes out of China or not is a bad actor. If you think any other country had anything to do with it, you're a bad actor. almost bordering on making treason. You're treason. You're making treasonous statements if you say the United States had anything to do with this. Pompeo has been going around saying, I've heard him at the press conferences and doing his own videos on the White House YouTube channel, pretty much alluding to that. Actually, interestingly enough, counter-signaling against Russia, Pompeo was saying that a lot of the misinformation was coming out of Russia, that America was involved in this. And there might be some truth to that. I mean, it is a possibility. Again, I said it could have come from Russia. And in doing so, that would make sense in that degree. We really don't know, out of all the countries, if this was a man-made bioweapon, who produced it, who released it, was an accident or not. We really don't know. So yeah, it's very plausible that this will end up a broken up part. China will be broken up. There might be World War III out of this. Not the nuclear World War III that we were all told by the CMP, like Tim LaHaye, would exist, and would the rapture would happen beforehand, and the second coming would happen.
Oh, and I always wanted to live out the Left Behind novels too, man. That's disappointing.
Well, I'm sorry, Stephen. As me being a Christian, I'm a mid-trib, post-trib person, so I think Tim LaHaye is a heretic in that regard. but it's very interesting. That's how most evangelical Christians in the United States get their theology, is left behind. With their pre-trib rapture, even though it's not very biblically sound, in my opinion.
No, it mostly just originated in the 19th century or something, right?
Yeah, and Tim LaHaye, left behind, and they all had more of your dominionism, CMP type beliefs. That's where it really took hold on. If you look at the early church fathers, none of them really talked about a pre-trib rapture and really be expounding upon it. So that's kind of like, Tom Clancy was a Council for National Policy member long term. So when we get all our Tom Clancy movies and China and nukes and everything, that's where a lot of all this propaganda came from, just like the Cold War propaganda. It came from the John Birch Society and would later come from the CMP until the Soviet Union's fall. So, that's what we're left with and it turns out that that's not the case. It turns out there's going to be some bioweapon that's going to usher in possibly World War III and an increased lockdown, increased destruction of our rights and possibly even martial law. Who knows at this point?
What's your take on that? The quote that's been really, or the passages that have really been making the rounds on the internet from the Dean Koontz, is it Koontz? I can't remember how it's pronounced, novel that was written in the early 80s. Because from what I can remember, he was a bit of a right-winger too. I think he had that one book that he wrote in the early 90s that was kind of a reaction to Ruby Ridge and so on and so forth. But I never really looked into him too much, but I've been kind of wondering if maybe he was a part of this crowd too, in terms of predictive programming and so forth.
I actually don't think he was. I'm a huge fan of Dean Koontz, actually. I have been for a long time. I've read almost every single one of his books. He's kind of like the counter-narrative to Stephen King in a lot of ways. So Dean Koontz, that's actually fake news. His book is Eyes of Darkness. It was written in 1981. The original virus that was mentioned in there was not the Wuhan 400. It was the Gorky 400. It was a Russian virus. It was later adapted in a future revision of his novel in the early late 2010s, late 2009s, when majority of his paperbacks got a new edition. They got updated, that it was changed to Wuhan.
All right, so yes, that is very interesting, especially with the later edition coming in, or the later change to that, especially. Okay, let's see here. Okay, so what about the EU? The great Gordon White has suggested that the EU's response would constitute a kind of Hail Mary to save the bloc. On the one hand, it gives them a pretext to finally crack down on the borders, which has been a major sticking point for a lot of the nationalists. And on the other hand, it might give them the pretext to introduce the first cashless, purely digital currency to solidify the monetary union. What's your take on that?
All right, I got to counter signal against Gordon White for a minute here, because when he was originally one of his streams back on the Higher Side Chats with Greg Carlwood, Gordon kind of poo-pooed on all of us conspiracy theorists now, believing in the cashless society and everything and what is to come. And he kind of, downplayed all that. Well, Gordon, it looks like, you've changed what you're suggesting now recently, and I have heard you make these comments, going back previously on ideas that you handed beforehand. Yeah, I agree with Gordon here. It does definitely seem like that's what's going to happen, and that I don't think I don't think they're going to be able to save the European Union. I suggested it probably will break up, which is what something like Stephen Bannon would want in Lost or Kill, at least on paper. But I think they're likely going to get some sort of digital currency. They thought about doing it here. They were floating it with the coronavirus relief bill. The Democrats were wanting to add it in, but they kind of signaled against that now, doing a digital Fed dollar. They also, now let me ask you something, Stephen. So we heard about the ID 2020 and them using an ID, like a biometric ID, and this would be a perfect time to implement that, right? Why did they push back the Real ID Act to not being necessary until October of next year?
That's a good question, certainly. I don't really have an easy answer for that other than potentially the backlash from it. I know, a lot of people have been hesitant to get those. It would require the federal driver's license essentially to board airplanes and that type of thing, correct?
Yes, and using it as more of a personal identification, having all your identifying markers it's on passports now. Kind of like being a step up from the Social Security number that was not at one time supposed to be a personal identifier, but it is now used for everything for identification. So this was supposed to be the next step up. It's supposed to be a biometric ID, contained on RFID chip. But yeah, they pushed it. They expanded. Are they gonna reduce something of it? Or people are gonna have to get new chips? Is it gonna be more complex? That's one thing I don't understand is why it got pushed back. I really don't get that.
Yeah, no, that I hadn't heard of that actually, but yes, that is pretty curious. Especially since they passed the Real ID Act in 2005 or something like that. You would certainly think after 15 years they would have been in, place to really get it finally implemented. So yes, that is rather curious.
Yeah, I don't have an answer of why that is, but yeah, where do you stand on the UN? Do you think that do you think they're going to become stronger than ever through this? Do you think some states are going to break off because they don't feel, some countries are going to break off because they don't feel like that they got enough support through this?
Do you mean the EU or the UN?
The EU, the European Union.
Okay. Yeah, I do think it is a bit of desperation, but yeah, I don't know at this point if they're really going to be able to save it at this point. I do think shutting down the borders would help with a lot of the populists, the populist movements that have been breaking out across the EU for really much of the last decade. But at this point in time, I just think that most of the bloc is so disillusioned with the rule from Brussels, and then on top of that you have just the ongoing division between the North and the South and Eastern Europe and Western Europe and so forth. And it seems like this might be too little too late to really save anything. And especially with the UK successfully managing to opt out, it reeks of desperation, I think, is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I as always, definitely, I definitely agree with you on that, Stephen. It does definitely reek of desperation. I don't know how long. We always thought that none of us saw this coming, completely. We're always taught through conspiracy culture that it would be a continued gathering of strength for globalism, and that you would eventually have the North American Union, and then you would have different unions of all the countries around the globe, and until you have one unified, complete UN Earth, one giant country being the whole entire Earth. But it looks like this is a huge blow to that, in my opinion. Now, why it happened, I don't know, but this is a huge blow to that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can kind of see the trend that the conspiracy theorists have been clinging to going up to the early 90s with the larger blocks emerging and so on and so forth. And this was, like you're saying, a precursor to a global government under the UN. But then, Russia, or I should say the Soviet Union collapses. Now suddenly you have all of these different nation states emerging from it. And then, going in about 15 or so years later, the EU starts to experience tremendous amount of pressure. Now, one of its major cornerstones succeeded from it. So it does seem like these mega political unions that were supposed to grease the way to the UN-backed one world government are disintegrating, and this has been an ongoing process really for decades now, to be perfectly honest. And yeah, I think it's definitely at this point a little too late to try to save that kind of structure. The cat's effectively out of the bag. And if we're kind of like we were talking about earlier too, if I mean some of the projects with China continue, it's quite possible you'll see the dissolvement of the People's Republic as well into multiple smaller nation states. So yeah, I mean the trend does seem to be going towards smaller states, ones that are easier to manage. If I would make some speculation on that.
Yes, I agree. I agree with your speculation.
But okay, so let's go into the UK a little bit. So the big news, I guess, today I saw when I woke up was that Boris Johnson had just been diagnosed with coronavirus.
Yes.
So that was kind of an interesting one, since he appears to be one of Trump's staunchest allies in this kind of nationalist faction, and may even have been pushing eventually for a kind of Anglo-American Union as globalization further breaks down. So, what's your perspective on Bojo kind of finally coming out with Corona today?
The same as Bolsonaro having and then not having it, who has it, who doesn't, the celebrities have it. I mean, some of this does appear to be grand theater, does it not?
Yeah.
I mean, Boris Johnson hails, the United Kingdom stance on this for the longest time was, well, just let the population get in through herd immunity, even though this is supposedly a novel coronavirus, meaning there is no or very low, very, very, very low amounts of native immunity to it. So, it's very interesting now he has it, I don't know. I mean, Prince Charles supposedly has it, is the Queen going to get it? Did the Pope have it when he, even when he was sick, even though he says that he didn't have it? I don't know. I mean, all I can say is from what I've seen, the UK is in trouble. So,
yeah.
Well, I mean, what do you think about it? I mean, to me, it just seems about right. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it could be, again, also potentially to break down, I mean, remaining resistance to try to forming a closer union with the United States. Of course, that's been a goal that, I mean, a lot of players within both the US and UK have been pushing for probably well over a century now. But with the UK finally out of the EU and potentially major economic instabilities, beginning to emerge there, I think that would really break down the last vestiges of opposition and labor and so forth, potentially to kind of forging some kind of, Atlantic trade pact or something like that.
Yeah. Because the United Kingdom would need that through Brexit, after Brexit.
Yeah, so. Absolutely. And then, you throw in the additional pressures from the coronavirus. I mean, probably the global depression that will bring about. I mean, certainly, I think at that point, a closer economic pact with the United States would be very appealing to a lot of circles there, but especially in the city.
Well, Lost Raquel will end up pushing for that. They've been in the past, so.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, especially with all the Tories that have pretty much taken over it since the 80s or something to that effect. So yeah, very interesting in that regard. But so anyway, what's your take on Bill Gates and all these CEOs who resigned in the early stages of the corona outbreak? Was this some kind of coordinated agenda, or were they simply seeing the writing on the wall in regards to the looming international depression?
My guess is they just had foreknowledge, possibly, of what was going to happen. I mean, I've always we'll discuss QAnon later, but everybody's saying, well, that's just proven that they're being arrested and being shipped off to Guantanamo Bay, to suffer military tribunals. That's silly. My guess is we did see some mainstream reports about the elite going to like their private islands and their private residence and stuff like that. I'm pretty sure there was some of that. The elites. I mean, that might have been why. Remember in the conspiracy culture, Stephen, that we're always taught that when there's an economic crisis, that gold and silver, skyrocket.
Yeah.
It didn't really happen this time at first, did it? Because gold and silver and cryptocurrency took a big fat dump the same time the stock market did. People needed cash for liquidity purposes, and so why would they need cash so much if they weren't escaping to their places or whatever and buying whatever necessary they can beforehand?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've always kind of thought that that was a crock. I mean, if you get to the kind of, complete social breakdown that a lot of the conspiracy theorists have argued when gold and silver would regain their status as an actual currency, it's just in a state like that where your money is basically worthless. I mean, the things that are going to have value are food, water, bullets, that type of thing. I mean, you can have all the gun or all the gold you want. If I've got, a bunch of guns and ammunition, I can always kill you and take your gold. You ultimately, you can't eat it. And if there is this sort of, total breakdown in currencies, it'll take some time to even get a barter economy reestablished. And even then, it's just like, what value does the gold really have to barter with? As I said before, it's not a food source. It's not really something you can use as a weapon to defend yourself with. It just, I've always thought that was really ridiculous, the way that this was promoted. Is like, well, if when the United States dollar finally fails, the only people who are going to be able to get anything are those of us with gold and silver. If it fails to that regard, we're probably going to have a period of mass social instability where there's not going to be a lot of trading in general going on.
No, it reminds me of what my friends have termed Niconomics, like nicotine. So if it ever becomes that mass casual, grand event around the world and everything's disrupted, we're going to move to a barter culture, with food and ammunition and cigarettes and alcohol, stuff people like and people need to live, right? It's not going to be, hey, I got some gold, let me get some food.
Yeah.
Why? Gold becomes useless at that point when you're delivering something for survival. Now, some people could say it could be the fallout method of people paying bottle caps or whatever, that there'll always be in some form of currency. And there always has been to some degree. But I do believe bartering, at one time was the basic economy that was a part of the entire world. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Kind of made me think too, it probably wouldn't be bad if you happened to own a cannabis farm as well. That would certainly give you something to barter with.
Yes.
If there is that kind of social collapse, and something that probably would have a lot of demand at that point too.
Very much so.
All right, so that might be an actual cash crop for all of you out there who are trying to find a currency to trade with in the apocalypse to consider.
One last thing, Stephen, on Bill Gates. There was that whole event 201 that happened with John Hopkins. That was
that's another big
half
trope
hour
right now.
Pandemic exercise that they used a novel coronavirus. It was through John Hopkins, the World Economic Forum, and Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation put it on. And they did do a possible scenario. It was backed on October 18th, 2019, of a coronavirus becoming a worldwide pandemic. So I mean, I don't trust Bill and Melinda Gates in the slightest bit. They're globalists. They're more on the left side of the world order. I don't, anytime that they're involved, I'm pretty sure it's not for our own good. Why would it be? Bill Gates is one of the richest men in the world. He's not going to, care about us or protect us or anything. And seems to be a big pusher of world wide vaccinations. So I don't trust anything that Bill Gates is involved in. So I'm not going to trust Event 201, supported by funding by the Open Philanthropy Project. Oh boy. So I guess it was a drill that went live, huh?
Apparently so. All right, so we've mainly been focusing on the globalists up to this point, but let's shift gears here for a few moments. Okay, so my personal belief was that Trump was put into the presidency for two reasons. One was to dismantle the Bretton Woods system that has dominated international markets since the end of the Second World War, and the second was to reorient American foreign policy away from Russia and towards containment of China. So far, he's mainly pushed these agendas through trade deals and security pacts and so forth. While everyone's talking up the New World Order right now, it sure seems like Trump has a golden opportunity to carry out a lot of these agendas, that seem to have been why he was put in there in the first place. And it's definitely been made a lot easier for him with the vast dictatorial powers he's been able to assume since this crisis started. But before we get to let's just say more serious discussion about this, let's talk about QAnon for a moment, as I know you just brought him up there. Obviously, some of the supporters of QAnon have been arguing that Trump is about to declare martial law so he can finally take down the pettyocracy and the deep state or whatever once and for all. So what do you think about that, John?
No, and if anybody believes that, they're an idiot. But a little bit more on that. I battle. I'm at war with QAnon, disciples of Q, on Twitter, and many people are, and just see the idiocy of these people. They were talking about when Trump was going to said that they're going to close down 10% of the restaurants in the United States are going to end up failing. And Trump actually knows a little bit something about business. Okay, like I'm not going to say that Trump is a complete dumb. All right, I'm not saying that he's the best business operator in the world. Okay, but to say that he completely knows nothing about business, he mentioned that restaurants have very razor thin margins, which is true. I mean, I can't. When Trump's right, I'm going to say he's right. I mean, let's be real here.
Folks, I work in the restaurant industry. That is 100% accurate. They all run with insane amounts of debt. The place I work with, they would probably be completely screwed if they had to shut down for 2 weeks. Let's just leave it at that. And from what I understand, that's the norm with a lot of places.
Yeah, and it's worse than your grocery store, for example. Okay, so when Trump said that, I'm not going to be like, well, Trump's a complete idiot, so he doesn't know what he's talking about. Yeah, Trump actually knows what he's talking about. He knew what he was talking about there. So Julian's Rum on Twitter, which is a huge QAnon disciple of Q pusher, was like making allusions. Well, maybe they're like Comet Pizza Ping Pong. They deserve to go out of business. Maybe that's what Trump meant by it. And I went off on him. I was like, what the heck are you talking about? I was like, the restaurant down the street from me, that I've eaten at, like the Mexican restaurant in Fayetteville, North Carolina, they're not part of some grand cabal like Comet Pizza Ping Pong was, where the elite ate, where the QAnon people hate to say that on 2 reviews that were separate before Pizzagate, that Tucker Carlson was mentioned as a very important person that frequented Comet Pizza Ping Pong very often, but they never tell you that. They only focus on James Alefantis and the rest of the globalist liberal crew. But yeah, so for him to say that's the stupidity that comes out of the disciples of Q. And yes, I understand that many of them mean well, and many of them are patriots, and they want what's best for their country, like both me and the people of the United States, like both me and you do, Stephen. I understand that. I'm not. Some of them anger me, but most of them mean well, even though they're brainwashed. So no, I don't. Actually, I guess one thing is Alex Jones, who used to talk about the Rex 84 program, but not really discuss Oliver North at great lengths. Council for National Policy member, both Alex Jones and Oliver North. But talked about Rex 84 and talked about the FEMA camps. He used to talk about those all the time. Well, he actually changed a couple of years back after Trump had gotten elected, and that the camps that everything he learned about Rex 84 was globalist liberal propaganda from the left side of the world order. And that he was mistaken. It was actually, they were put there not for dissidents of the Central American War that the CNP wanted, because they were worried that, like the hippies, people would be like, I'm not fighting down there in no Latin American Civil War. I'm not sending my boys off for that. What are you talking about? It was not for that. It was for the illegal immigrants that were going to rush from the destabilization of El Salvador and Nicaragua, for example. And they were going to have to put those illegal immigrants and refugees into camps. And that was the reason why that they were there. And of course, Michael Savage, Michael Weiner, he's Jewish, major Zionist. He mentions that maybe some of those camps should be for liberal followers because they're deranged, or for people who use Twitter, who are crazy on Twitter. It's very interestingly enough, a person of Jewish descent is telling for people to go to camps, but I digress. What I'm getting at is they've changed the narrative, Stephen, on these camps. That they're not for you and me. The sealed indictments would not be for you and me. You know, the truthers and people that are active agents or people that are against the government are seen by that way by the government. They won't go to those camps. Those camps are for all our worst enemies. You know, Hillary Clinton and all the pedophile elite in Hollywood. And I'm not saying that I am a fan of Hillary Clinton and the crimes. I don't know the crimes of the Clintons. You and I both know that the crimes of the Clintons are enormous. They fill volumes. But to say that the crimes of Trump do not equal that, or Roy Cohn, is silly. So that's my main issue with all this is now the camps are for, you know, the deep state cabal to go down to Guantanamo Bay and they go round up all the world pedophiles that you hate. But none of the conservatives, Ronald Wilson Reagan or George H.W. Bush and the Franklin scandal, you know, they didn't do anything wrong. Trump didn't do anything wrong with Epstein. You know, it's all on the left. That's a major problem with me.
Well, I always thought a lot of that was rather ridiculous because, I mean, you know, as you were kind of alluding to, Rex 84 was initiated by the great Ronald Reagan, and going back to its predecessors, Operation Garden Plot, I believe, was initiated by Nixon when he was the president, and then there was I think the related Cabal Splicer in California, again by Ronald Reagan when he was the governor there. So, I mean, in a sense, at least, I think, you know, Jones and them might be onto something in that probably these camps were always intended for illegal immigrants and hippies and that type of thing. But certainly, I do think anyone ultimately who stands in their way will end up in these places. Because really, I mean, I think at the upper levels, the only real ideology is power. And who has it, and, you know, who stands in the way of power. So ultimately, anybody who is seen in opposition to this will be dispatched there, and most likely they're not going to be joined there by Hillary Clinton or any of the other, you know, major figures in the pediocracy or whatever you want to call it, so long as they're willing to fall in line ultimately.
Yes, I agree, and that's why it makes me so angry. So, as I'm sure it does you. So.
Yeah. I mean, it is ridiculous in a lot of levels, but yes, especially since, as I said, it's just a lot of this was really dreamed up by the great Ronald Reagan. So yeah, that should probably give you an indication as to just who exactly was devising this agenda. But so anyway, okay, let's get back to Trump and what's going on right now. I mean, it really seems like he's finally gotten a golden opportunity to really restrict the borders once and for all. But also to bring back defense-related industries to this country, because I really think that was really the underlining factor behind the whole American first thing and wanting to bring the jobs back here from China. Specifically, I think they really wanted to beef up our domestic, you know, defense capabilities, because ultimately, if you are going to fight a third world war or something like that, you really don't want to have to get your ammunition and your armaments from your, you know, the country you're at war with. That's a little problematic. So what's your take on that?
If it was before this pandemic, I would say not a cool chance in hell. It didn't seem like nothing was going to get done with bringing back manufacturing here. Unless we were going to go to war, that had to happen, and that's the only solution. So if you're going to have a war, you got to bring your manufacturing back.
Well, absolutely.
I didn't think this is going to be the. I don't think anybody foresaw this is the way they were going to do it, but that's what they're doing. So if we're going to have any war in the Middle East with Iran or China or South Korea, which it seems more like China and South Korea now than anything, you got to bring your manufacturing back. You got to have a manufacturing base to go to war. Major war, you can't have your manufacturers scattered to other countries, especially other countries you're going to war with. So it does seem. I always said, well, not always, but I said many years ago, around 2014, before I had bought into Trump mania, how stupid and deluded I was. But I said the next president was going to milk the golden calf of the United States one more time before it just kills over and dies. Okay, and that seems to be what Trump did with the stock market being as high as it ever has been. You know, and I economically I do think that it would be better off if we had tariffs and abolished the income tax and go back how this country was originally funded. You know, and I'm not going to
Oh,
say the
absolutely.
fathers were upstanding citizens. Most of them were theists and deists and stuff like that, and illuminists, but Masons. But I'm not. But I mean, they were right about that. If you had to choose one or the other, which one seems better for the populace? Having a Federal Reserve or income tax, or having tariff collection. I think I'd go with tariff collection.
Well, absolutely. And I mean, it was really selected because, I mean, effectively, it's essentially a voluntary tax. I mean, if I don't want to pay a tariff on a Japanese car, for instance, I can just choose to buy an American one. Or, I mean, when you get into, say, something like vice taxes or something like that, if I, don't want to pay a vice tax on cigarettes, I can just grow my own tobacco and roll my own cigarettes and avoid that. So there is that element to it. And, that's why it's kind of interesting now when you just see the pathological opposition to tariffs. Even though when you really, get down and look at the U.S. Constitution and read the section on taxing powers, that was pretty much the one thing that the founders wanted us to use to fund the government with those tariffs. There's nothing in there about income taxes or anything. But yes. The one taxing method that was approved by the founding fathers is the one that now is resisted, just vehemently by almost all sections of American society for whatever reason. It's quite incredible.
Now, Stephen, now you can't fund all these black budget projects and print infinite money if if it wasn't for if you did it by tariffs, you couldn't do all that now. So that's
yes, absolutely. Okay, Trump, one of the big claims he's been making lately is he would like to get the nation back to work essentially by Easter. I mean, do you see this as possibly an attempt to try to rev the economy up so we don't fall behind China, which is allegedly recovering, though that's obviously a bit debatable, as you were alluding to earlier?
I think it's just some crazy ploy by the Council for National Policy just to drum up Easter. I mean, it was just he had to. Trump has always said some weird things about this that maybe I don't know. Maybe Bannon and them have the cure and they're going to rush it out. I don't know. But Trump did say like as soon as the coronavirus is here, it'll magically go away like a miracle. And I'm paraphrasing for Trump, but he did mention that previously, like weeks ago. So I almost wonder if that's something that they're going to do, like it's going to, they're going to have some sort of cure or all of a sudden it's going to disappear. It's going to run its course. It's going to mutate out like a targeted bioweapon would and would render to be ineffective around Easter. And then all of a sudden, it's like, aha, it's okie doke. China's economies and crumbles, but we're going to move all our manufacturing back and go to war. I don't know. I mean, I'm speculating here. It could be the opposite of that, and we did depopulate 75% of the more of the planet through multiple waves of the coronavirus. I don't know, but I will say that the bare minimum, me being a Christian, when Trump and the CNP are talking about Easter, it makes me raise an eyebrow, Stephen, and be like, "What are you doing here?" Because my wife's family, for example, which are big evangelical born again Christians, they're going to eat all that up. And I'm like, something ain't right here. So I think that's almost what it is just some sort of massing signaling to his base, the CNP's base of these Christians that are evangelical Christians that are hypnotized by them.
Now, it's interesting that you bring that up. When did Lent start this year? It was in February.
I don't remember the start. It was I know. Easter is I'm bad with the dates. I'm horrible with
dates.
It's
like what about 40? It's 40 days or something.
It is,
like
but
that,
I can't remember exactly the day it started on. That's why I got to look it up. I got it on my calendar. Which I do celebrate Lent, even though I'm not Catholic. The 12th of April will be Easter Sunday.
Okay. So yeah, but yeah, I just was mentioning that because I was wondering if there was anything related to, because I'm trying to remember when the coronavirus really started to be taken seriously in the United States. I was kind of wondering if that might have lined up roughly with the
No,
advent of
it was after the beginning of Lent because they were still having the Fat Tuesday celebrations and Mardi Gras.
yes. Okay. All right. Well, just wanted to kind of check on that. But yeah, I know they were yeah, Mardi Gras essentially went down this year uninterrupted. But yeah, I mean obviously a lot of these groups really like their numerology, their different dates and so on and so forth. And since this particular faction we're talking about is working, I guess, from a nominal Christian perspective, though obviously that's really debatable. I mean, there's been a lot of occult doctrine certainly that's been transferred to
Oh
this, but
yes.
yes, just kind of wondering though if there might have been some significance to that. But yeah, I think you're correct about that.
Breaking news, Stephen. You might find this interesting. President Trump issues order in effort to force General Motors to produce ventilators under the Defense Production Act. Trump was telling me all these corporations were bending over, you know, were bending over, hand over fist trying to produce whatever they possibly can to help out. So he's going to force General Motors to make some ventilators.
Yes, that is definitely interesting, especially when you kind of think about getting the country back on war footing and what have you. I mean, we certainly could see more of that, maybe with official orders demanding that some of these defense-related industries and factories are moved back. Really, no choice in the matter for the companies, and that would certainly, I think, be in keeping with the agenda that he's been trying to push since being elected.
Yeah,
Um, but anyway, we already kind of went into this a little bit before, but maybe you can elaborate on it here. Initially, I mean, it seems like the regions that have been hit the hardest, China, Iran, and also the now UK-less EU specifically, have been, the regions that I think have really been in Trump's crosshairs more than any other. It does seem like it kind of stretches coincidence a little bit that these would be the regions most under siege, wouldn't you say?
yeah, I definitely, 100%. Even though we really don't know the numbers in North Korea, right? Now there was some interesting. Now, have you ever? Okay, so you've heard of North Koreans like trying to escape to China, right?
Yeah.
To live in China. Have you ever heard North Korea? I mean, China warning its citizens to not cross the North Korean border because they will be shot by North Korea?
No, not off the top of my head, though that
Because
wouldn't
that
surprise
happened
me.
during this coronavirus pandemic.
Oh, okay, that is interesting,
The
especially in
Communist Chinese Party was telling people to not cross the border to escape China because they will be shot.
yeah, that is pretty incredible. Yeah, especially also with how Trump has been trying to cozy up to the North Korean regime really since he got into office as well. And I mean, it's also interesting that South Korea seems like it's been, hit fairly hard as well. Of course, that was a country where there seems to have been some disillusionment setting in with the United States in recent months, last couple of years, and so on and so forth. So
And
certainly
it was
this.
spread by some Mooney-like cult
Yes,
too,
I know, in some kind of strange Christian cult. Yes, and this, like you were kind of
probably
alluding to,
propped up by the KCIA.
it would hardly be surprising. But yeah, I mean, it kind of seems like this has potentially, created a dynamic where once again South Korea is going to be having additional hostilities towards China, and with Trump making inroads to North Korea, I mean, that could set up a potential with a reunification of Korea as a
Yeah,
counterweight to the People's Republic over there.
yeah, very much so. I guess we'll have to wait and see. We'll have to wait and see what happens over there. But yeah, it seems like all the enemies were hit the hardest. Well, it'd be interesting about Venezuela and what happens in up there, especially with us, saying drug trafficking, Department of Justice leveling drug trafficking charges against Maduro, and William Barr being a part of that. When I'm like, well, no one did anything when the Council for National Policy was sponsoring the Iran-Contra affair, and among with Nicaragua, among other countries down there in Latin America and South America, the flow of cocaine to produce crack, with Freeway Rick Ross, no one did, Barr didn't do anything then, so why is he doing anything now? Like it's so
Yeah, yeah.
ludicrous.
Yeah, well, to paraphrase the Great Apocalypse Now film, I mean, yeah, handing out charges for drug trafficking there is kind of like handing out a speeding ticket at the Indy 500. It's, yes, as you say, it's pretty bloody absurd. All right, so establishment mouthpiece Foreign Affairs recently hailed this as the end of globalization as we know it. The rapid spread of corona was due to globalization, and the inevitable supply chain shortages that will follow will also be due to globalization. The thinking is this will spark a tremendous backlash. No, we've already kind of gone over this before, but I take it that you see this as being the case, correct?
Yeah, and it's very interesting that the Council on Foreign Relations would say that this is the death of globalism. Granted, I guess they're not happy about it. But you know, maybe again, it's all because like the Rockefellers both funded the Council on Foreign Relations and the Council for National Policy. You know, maybe it's just maybe this new form of government or whatever this is going to end up being. Maybe if we become more fascist or more national socialist, if the government has to start. What if private business fails, Recluse, and we're ruled by corporatocracy, almost like a national socialist, where everything's nationalized. You know, the oil industry is nationalized, the healthcare industry is nationalized. You can't pay your rent, so the government's going to hold your deed because the banks failed. And as long as you're good with your social credit score, you know, you can stay in your house. You know, it's almost like they're moving into almost a synarchy type government structure, or even national socialist government structure at that point before synarchy, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's why it's interesting you kind of brought up GM just a little while ago. Because, I mean, in the case of Nazi Germany, they didn't necessarily full-blown nationalize the companies. Instead, what they typically did was just force them to put Nazi party officials on the board of directors and so forth so that they would comply with the dictates of the Nazi party.
Interesting, almost like government crony capitalism.
Yeah, essentially. And I mean, I kind of wonder, you know, with the announcement with GM, is this sort of what Trump is hitting at? Is he going to start using this as a means to start putting Trump loyalties on the boards of a lot of these corporations? And on that note, too, let me just bring this up right quick. I saw another interesting thing coming out. Yes, with the Pentagon. So the Pentagon apparently is fearing with the stock market collapse that foreigners might try to start buying controlling interests in defense companies and so on and so forth. And they're already talking about really pumping up this this piece of legislation that was passed in 1975, the Committee for Foreign Investment in the United States, and essentially using this to block foreigners from buying controlling interests in our defense industry. And specifically, they're really worried about the Chinese in this regard as well. So, I mean, I could see this as another, you know, we're going to use this as a backdoor to start having the government invest in our own defense industry. So that way it doesn't fall under the hands of foreigners. And then in the interim, we're going to start putting Trump loyalists in these board of directors for these companies to, you know, just make sure they're keeping track of how the money's being spent and that type of thing. But
Yeah, very much so. We'll see what happens with this. You know, a lot of this, all we've done, you know, we've tried to look at the parapolitics and try to look at the machinations. As we're in the fog of war, all we're doing is speculating at this point. You know.
well, absolutely. But so let's like speculate though one last time here before we wrap things up. Okay. So, you know, we've talked about the 2024 election. You projected that a socialist will win that one, which I think is very plausible at this point. Now, Martin Armstrong, the controversial economist, has been projecting a civil war breaking out in the United States around 2027, which I also think is quite plausible, especially if you're correct and the socialist does win in 2024, and then you're probably going to have all of these, you know, disgruntled Trumpites kind of lurking in the background of the government, so to speak. So, you know, arguably you could say that there's already been a cold civil war going on for a couple of years now, but is it possible the corona is going to be the trigger to start making this hot? Is this going to be kind of the lead up to really a full blown civil war breaking out in the country in 2027? What's your take on that?
It's very, very possible. Now, I still believe Trump's going to be reelected in 2020. I think the Council for National Policy has been pushing for that. And I said that Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic nominee. It's still possible. We still might get a Cuomo-Clinton ticket, Biden-Clinton ticket, even though the allegations against Biden now, I think Biden may be out. Although we might not get any, or we might not get any ticket at all, and Trump just might be God Emperor forever. I don't know, but I still assume that we're probably going to get a socialist in 2024. I don't see one quite yet, but anything's possible. The coronavirus threw a curveball, and anything that we want to discuss about parapolitics within the United States when it comes to the election. So yeah, I mean, Corona definitely made it hard to determine it. It seemed so clear in the weeks beforehand, but now it's like, well, I don't know. Now you might talk about a civil war. Is it possible that Corona makes a civil war hot? Yeah, I mean, if they start doing martial law and FEMA camps and Alex Jones's wet dream and everything the conspiracy theorists thought it possible, then yeah, I mean, yeah, it's very possible we might end up with a civil war and breakdown of society. Now, I don't think it's going to go that far, but it's more possible now than it was 3 months ago. If as far as me believing that to be true. Where it's gone up in percentage points from being possible to plausible at this point. Depending on how more draconian the laws get and how much more the government puts its foot down and enforces certain aspects. So I mean, I don't know. I mean, what's your take on it, Stephen? How do you feel?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's possible, and it might even accelerate the timeline that Martin Anderson was talking about. I mean, I think he was mainly going on the perspective that the Civil War would probably be triggered by the massive job losses that were brought about with automation, people being replaced by robots, and so on and so forth. But I mean, it seems like with what's happening now in the economy, instead of a lot of that, starting to break out in the middle of this decade, it might, start happening in the coming months, essentially. So that's definitely an interesting dynamic right there. And then, as you said before, I mean, there's always the possibility that we may not even have an election this year. I don't think that can be ruled out at this point, certainly. So, yeah, I mean, that would certainly be an interesting dynamic in and of itself. And also, like you're kind of alluding to as well, I mean, just the candidates that the Democratic Party fielded this year are just disastrous. And Biden, yeah, I mean, he's essentially a low-rent version of Donald Trump. And I mean, who wants that, really? I mean, you might as well vote for the real thing in the actual Republican Party instead of a watered-down version of either one.
What about Bloomberg? What about Bloomberg? Oh, I know Bloomberg's out, but man, that sure was something, wasn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it was like, yeah, I mean, like I said, I mean, I know Chris Knowles has already been saying that, I mean, basically we have two Republican parties for a couple of years now. And I mean, I think that really pretty much confirmed it. I mean, yes, we're now basically openly having a lifelong Republican running on the Democratic ticket for, yeah, and nobody even really made much of an issue of it, at least in the establishment circles. It's incredible. But it's kind of interesting, though, with the rise of some of these Democratic governors. I mean, you alluded to Cuomo in New York, and there's also the guy in California and so forth.
Gavin Newsom.
Yeah, I mean, I have kind of wondered if they're trying to pump them up possibly as a last-ditch effort, because, I mean, I don't think there's really any way Biden could beat Trump, to be perfectly honest. I don't care how bad the response to the coronavirus is. I just think once the debates and what have you start happening, I mean, Biden is just going to be a disaster, combined with probably the ticking time bomb of various, allegations of sexual misconduct and so forth surrounding him. Yeah, I think there's a lot that will probably come out by October that would completely sink Biden.
I mean, the Council for National Policy want another Trump presidency. I'm pretty sure we're going to get it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think even more broadly speaking, I mean, like you were kind of saying before, I mean, when you kind of pull back the mask far enough, I mean, you start seeing the same kind of families, the Rockefellers supporting the CFR and the CNP. And I kind of think at the upper level, the decision was made that, globalism had not worked out the way they wanted it, and it was time to go in a different direction. And I mean, you even sort of see that with, the kind of the bizarre relationship with Henry Kissinger and the Trump regime, where Kissinger kind of seems like he's been acting as a back channel to Trump and the Russians, since he took office. So, yeah, I mean, I think in a sense this is kind of signaling that at the upper echelon, they've decided to go in a different direction. And right now you're kind of seeing a lot of the underlings doing everything that they can to, you're in the globalist faction to preserve it. And, ultimately it's probably going to be a losing battle.
Yeah, very much so, Stephen. I mean, none of us truly know, except maybe none of us conspiracy researchers or investigative journalists know. But what's going to happen? We're all speculating at this point. I mean, we still don't know exactly the objective truth of 9/11 or the Kennedy assassination at this point. So for us to be able to understand this while it's actively going on, it's everybody has their own take on it, and everybody has their own belief, and all I could say is just prepare for what you can and spend the time with your family and people that you love, and just try to be good to one another as much as you possibly can, and try to go back. And I guess one thing they're saying is maybe this will get what the nationalists want more of, which is stronger communities and strongly family structure out of this.
And
We'll see.
Certainly that would be one silver lining, no doubt. Well, John, it's been great having you on here. Is there anything you wanted to add before we wrap up?
No, that's it. You guys can find me. We read the documents on YouTube. We've _ read on Twitter. I have Recluse on a lot, interviewing on my show. I'll definitely have him on again. I want to thank you for having me on the farm. I miss Frank. Tell him I said hey.
Yeah. Well, I was already thinking we should have you back here maybe in a couple of weeks to go over some Franklin's, or not Franklin, the Finders. Definitely, you've got a book coming out on that. Hopefully in the near future.
Yes. Hopefully this year. Corona may have stalled some things of me getting some final interviews, but we'll see. But definitely thank you for having me on. I'm a long-time fan of your work, Recluse, and I'm a listener of the farm. And anybody who's listening, if this is your first time, you definitely need to follow Recluse's work on Vice of View and listen to the farm and subscribe and everything. So thank you very much for having me on.
Well, thank you very much for the endorsement, John. Well, folks, that's it for this week's installment, though hopefully, like as I said earlier, Frank will also have some new material coming to you guys on pop culture here at some point later in the week. And next week, I think both of us will be back on the podcast again to talk some fandom, some geekdom, be it Star Trek or Babylon 5. Until then, folks, stay tuned. And, as John alluded to, just watch yourselves, spend the time with your family, and ultimately do something that's important to you. Why, we have this all layoff and what have you. Don't just sit around and be a paranoid mess. If there's a book you've always wanted to write, an album or a song you've always wanted to record or whatever, nothing's stopping you from doing it now. Do something that you're passionate about. That's really the best thing, the best advice that you can get for this whole set of extraordinary events. And with that, I am signing off for now. Good night and good luck.